think the key to sustaining a long career is individuality.
'Cause I'm so into you, yeah. I celebrate my love for you.
He started walking at 10 months. He went from, when he turned one on December 30th, he skipped a whole year and went straight into his terrible twos.
Wow. Before the world ever heard his name, before radio playlists and award stages, there was a quiet beginning in South Carolina shaped by faith, discipline, and listening. Peabo Bryson was born and raised in Greenville, a place where music was not a luxury, but a language. In the black churches of the South, sound carried meaning long before it carried ambition. Gospel was not about performance. It was about endurance, about holding a congregation together when words alone were not enough. Peabo grew up in that environment. Raised primarily by his mother, he learned responsibility early. Stability was not guaranteed, and like many children in similar circumstances, he found consistency in church. Sunday mornings were structured, predictable, safe, and within that structure, music became something deeper than expression. It became grounding. In later interviews, Peabo would often return to this period of his life, not with nostalgia, but with clarity. Gospel taught him restraint. It taught him that a voice could be powerful without being loud. That emotion didn't need to be forced to be felt. The singers he heard as a child didn't rush. They waited. They trusted the room. They trusted the silence between notes. That lesson became foundational. As a boy, his voice stood out, but it was never pushed forward aggressively. There was no sense of urgency to turn talent into opportunity. Singing wasn't treated as an escape from where he was. It was treated as a responsibility, something to take seriously, something to respect. He listened more than he spoke, watched how older singers controlled their breathing, how they phrased lines so the meaning landed before the volume, how they could hold a note just long enough to make people lean in. Those instincts would define his sound years later. As he grew older, music slowly expanded beyond church walls, but gospel never left him. Even when he encountered secular music, he carried that same discipline with him. He wasn't drawn to flash. He was drawn to feeling, to songs that said something quietly instead of loudly. This mindset shaped his early development as an artist. Rather than chasing immediate recognition, Peabo took time to learn the craft. He didn't step into the industry with illusions. His first professional experiences were grounded, practical, and humbling. Touring with established acts, observing how the business worked, learning how stages felt night after night. He performed with the group Moses Dillard and the Textown Display, gaining firsthand exposure to live audiences and the realities of working musicians. These years were not glamorous, but they were crucial. They gave him patience, perspective, and a clear understanding that longevity mattered more than speed. What separated Peabo from many aspiring singers of his generation was intention. He was not interested in being the loudest voice in the room. He was interested in being the most honest one. His baritone developed naturally without strain or imitation. He didn't chase high notes for effect. He stayed where his voice felt truthful. In interviews decades later, he spoke about never wanting to sound like someone else. That desire for authenticity wasn't a marketing decision. It was rooted in his upbringing, in the gospel tradition that valued sincerity over spectacle. By the time he began stepping forward as a solo artist in the 1970s, his identity was already clear. The music industry didn't shape him. It met him where he already stood. His early recordings reflected that. Smooth, measured, emotionally controlled. There was a calm confidence in his delivery, as if he trusted listeners to meet him halfway. He didn't oversell heartbreak, he allowed it to exist. This approach wasn't accidental. It was learned. In pews instead of studios, in choirs instead of classrooms, in a community where music was meant to heal before it was meant to impress. That grounding would soon become his greatest strength. As the wider world began to notice his voice, Peabo carried his beginnings with him. The church never disappeared from his sound. It lived in his pacing, his phrasing, his respect for silence, and as opportunities began to open, he stepped forward not as a newcomer chasing attention, but as an artist already formed, ready, patient, and deeply rooted in where he came from. The foundation had been set. When Peabo Bryson stepped fully into the professional music world, he did not arrive with urgency. He arrived with patience. The years following his early development were marked by steady movement rather than sudden ascent. While many artists of the time were chasing radio formulas or reshaping themselves to fit emerging trends, Peabo moved deliberately. He understood that longevity required more than visibility. It required grounding. By the mid to late 1970s, his voice began finding its place within R&B, not as a novelty, but as a presence. His baritone stood apart, warm, controlled, emotionally precise. It wasn't the kind of voice that demanded attention, it earned it over time. Those early solo recordings reflected everything he had learned in church and on the road. The pacing was unhurried, the delivery intentional. He sang as if he were speaking directly to one listener, not an arena. That intimacy became his signature. As R&B entered what would later be recognized as its golden era, Peabo Bryson's approach aligned naturally with the moment. This was a period when audiences valued emotional depth, when songs were allowed to breathe, when maturity was not a liability but a strength. His music found a home in what became known as quiet storm radio, late-night programming built around reflection and feeling. Peabo's songs fit seamlessly into that space. They spoke to adults who had lived enough to recognize themselves in his lyrics. In interviews, he later described this period as one of alignment rather than strategy. He wasn't trying to capture a demographic. He was simply being himself at a time when the culture was receptive to that authenticity. His rise during this era was steady and unmistakable. With each release, his reputation grew, not just among listeners, but among musicians. Singers noticed his breath control, his phrasing, his refusal to oversing. He knew exactly how far to go and, more importantly, when to stop. That restraint gave his performances weight. Peabo became known as someone who respected the song more than the spotlight. As his visibility increased, so did industry recognition. He appeared on major stages. His voice became familiar across radio formats that valued sophistication and emotional honesty. Yet even as his profile rose, he remained consistent in how he presented himself. There was no attempt to reinvent, no sudden shift in image, no pressure to exaggerate his persona. In conversations years later, Peabo would reflect on this period with clarity. He understood that the music industry often rewards those who chase the moment, but he believed that chasing moments could cost artists their identity. For him, staying grounded mattered more than staying current. That belief guided his decisions as the 1980s progressed. While R&B continued to thrive, subtle shifts were already underway. Production styles began to change, youth culture grew more influential, the seeds of a faster, sharper sound were being planted. Peabo noticed, but he did not react. Instead of adjusting his voice to compete with new textures, he leaned further into what made him distinct: emotional clarity, vocal control, songs that trusted listeners to feel rather than be told what to feel. This wasn't stubbornness, it was conviction. He believed that his audience would find him as long as he remained honest, that truth would outlast fashion. And for a time, he was right. His concerts continued to draw loyal crowds. His records continued to resonate with listeners who valued substance over spectacle. The golden era did not elevate him temporarily. It validated who he already was. But as the decade moved forward, it became clear that the industry was preparing to move in a different direction, one that would test every artist who had built their career on patience. Peabo Bryson stood at that threshold fully formed, rooted, respected, and unwilling to compromise the foundation he had spent a lifetime building. What came next would not be defined by how loudly he could adapt, but by how firmly he could remain himself. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the world around Peabo Bryson was changing faster than it ever had before. The shift did not arrive all at once. It came in layers: new production styles, shorter attention spans, louder records, younger faces being pushed to the front. R&B began to blur into something sharper, faster, more aggressive. Image started to matter as much as voice, sometimes more. Peabo saw it happening. He understood it, but understanding did not mean agreement. Around this time, his career reached one of its most visible moments. The duet A Whole New World introduced his voice to an audience far beyond the R&B world. The song became a global success, earning major accolades and cementing his place in popular culture for millions of listeners who had never encountered his earlier work. It was a high point, and quietly, it was a narrowing one. In later interviews, Peabo spoke with honesty about that moment. He appreciated the opportunity. He respected the achievement, but he also recognized how easily a single success could redefine an artist in the public eye. For some listeners, decades of soul, restraint, and emotional depth were suddenly condensed into one cinematic moment. The industry loved that simplicity, but Peabo had never built his career on simplicity. He had built it on layers. As the 1990s progressed, the space for artists like him grew smaller. Ballad singers who relied on nuance rather than spectacle found themselves pushed to the margins. The industry didn't reject them openly. It simply stopped prioritizing them. There was no dramatic fallout, no public conflict, just fewer calls, fewer invitations, less radio support. Peabo did not respond by chasing relevance. In interviews, he later explained that he had no interest in sounding like artists half his age. He believed that growth did not mean imitation, that maturity did not need to apologize for itself. He understood that trying to keep up would require him to abandon the very qualities his audience trusted. So he didn't. Instead, he continued to record selectively. He continued to perform. He allowed his career to evolve quietly rather than explode artificially. His concerts became less about promotion and more about connection. The people who came were not looking for trends. They were looking for truth. This period also brought new realities. Health challenges began to surface, not as a crisis, but as a gradual adjustment. Touring demanded more care. Rest became essential. For a vocalist whose instrument lived inside his body, listening to physical limits was not optional. What stood out was how little he sensationalized any of it. Peabo never framed his health as a tragedy. He spoke about learning balance, about understanding that longevity required restraint not just in music, but in life, that pushing through everything was not strength. Sometimes stepping back was. There were pauses, there were canceled appearances, there were moments when fans wondered if he would return. And when he did, he returned without apology. On stage, his approach remained unchanged. He didn't compete with his younger self. He didn't stretch beyond what felt honest. His voice carried experience now, not just control, but perspective. He sang as someone who had lived inside his songs, not just performed them. Among fellow musicians, his respect never faded. Vocalists continued to cite him as a reference point, a model of phrasing, of breath, of emotional discipline. He became what many called a singer's singer. An artist whose mastery is most visible to those who understand the craft. Outside the spotlight, his music continued to live where it always had, in memory, in quiet spaces, in the lives of people who had grown alongside it. The industry had moved on. Peabo Bryson had not, and in that contrast, something unexpected happened. His refusal to adapt became its own kind of statement. In a culture driven by reinvention, he represented continuity. Proof that an artist could survive without reshaping himself into something unrecognizable. His journey through this period was not about loss. It was about narrowing focus, stripping away everything except what mattered. Voice, truth, presence. What remained was not louder. By the time the noise of the industry fully shifted away from him, Peabo Bryson had already made a quiet decision about what his career would and would not be. He would not chase relevance. He would not reshape his voice to fit a moment. He would not turn his life into a performance just to stay visible. Instead, he chose endurance. As the years moved forward, Peabo's presence became more selective, but no less meaningful. His concerts were no longer about scale. They were about connection. Smaller rooms, loyal audiences, listeners who came not to be entertained, but to be reminded of something steady in a world that rarely slowed down. On stage, there was no illusion of timelessness. He did not pretend that age had not arrived. He embraced it. His phrasing carried even more intention. His pauses spoke as loudly as his notes. He trusted his audience enough to leave space. That trust was mutual. People didn't come to hear perfection, they came to hear truth. Health remained part of the conversation, not publicly dramatized, but privately managed. Peabo spoke in interviews about learning how to listen to his body the same way he had learned to listen to music, about understanding limits not as weakness, but as information, about respecting rest as part of discipline, not its opposite. This perspective mirrored his entire philosophy: restraint over excess, clarity over noise, longevity over urgency. In an era where artists are often encouraged to turn every personal struggle into content, his refusal to do so stood out. He did not monetize vulnerability. He lived it quietly. That choice kept his narrative intact. Over time, his reputation settled into something deeper than fame. Among musicians, he became a reference point, a benchmark, someone whose work was studied rather than imitated. His breath control, his emotional pacing, his ability to convey intimacy without spectacle. These were not trends, they were fundamentals. Within the Black community, his music never left. It lived in moments that didn't require explanation. Anniversaries, late-night drives, reflections that came with age. His songs matured alongside the people who loved them, revealing new meanings as life added layers. That is a rare relationship between artist and audience. Peabo Bryson's legacy is not built on dominance or reinvention. It is built on consistency, on knowing exactly who he was early and never letting the world talk him out of it. When discussions arise about what it means to be a real singer, his name surfaces without effort, not as nostalgia, as grounding, as proof that technique and emotion do not need to compete. They can coexist. In today's fast-moving culture, his music feels almost countercultural. It asks for patience. It rewards attention. It reminds listeners that feeling deeply does not require volume. That reminder matters, because music at its best is not about keeping up. It's about staying connected. to yourself, to others, to time as it moves forward. Peabo Bryson did not survive by adapting to every shift in the industry. He survived by understanding which shifts mattered and which did not. He stayed rooted when it would have been easier to perform change. He chose authenticity over applause, and in doing so, he left behind something that trends cannot erase. A voice that waits instead of demands. A legacy that deepens instead of fades. A reminder that true longevity in music is not measured by how loudly you are remembered, but by how long you are felt. That is what remains.